Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining today's webinar. I think we're going to get started. My name is Kumbrai and I'm part of the inquiries team here at Oxford College of Marketing. I'd just like to note that this webinar is being recorded and so it can be sent out afterwards. Today we have a really interesting webinar hosted by Carmel on the crisis, a best practice survival guide to help you manage and recover from tough events. Carmel is a CIPR tutor here at the college with over 30 years experience in public relations, so she's really qualified for today's talk. We'll have the presentation from Carmel first, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. At the end, if you could just pop your questions into the chat, and then we'll be able to answer your questions. So Carmel, I'll hand over to you now.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining me. I'm going to share my screen now and talk you through a presentation, very much a whistle-stop tour of essential issues about dealing with crises. Tiny bit about myself. I initially trained as a journalist, worked in journalism for 8 years, and then worked in PR, different sectors, public, private sector, television, arts, regeneration, all sorts of different things, as is very often the case with PR. Lots of crisis management experience during my practitioner-facing work. And I also then taught in higher education for 15 years. So I taught crisis communications to undergraduates and postgraduate students at Sheffield Hallam University. And as Kumbira said, I am now working and teaching predominantly on the specialist diploma in crisis communications for the Oxford Professional Education Group. So there'll be some details on that on the slides towards the end of this presentation. I'm going to talk for, hopefully, I will apologise now, I'm going to whistle stop through the slides to get through the content, but also then to make sure that I leave some time at the end for you to ask any questions that you might find useful. So probably talk for about 30 to 40 minutes and leave a good sort of little margin at the end for you to follow up and ask anything that might be useful to you. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. Is that visible, Kumbarai? Yeah.
Yes.
Good
Yes.
stuff. All right, lovely. So, yeah, I'm Carmel O'Toole. Whistle Stop Guide to Crisis Management, the Essentials. I mean, necessarily, I teach a 6-week course, and obviously I've taught modules which last 12 weeks. So this is very much a summarized approach to some of the essential content that will help guide you through the worst of crises. So pictures on the front there, we'll come back to some of those examples. You see Mohammed Al-Fayed, no prizes for guessing why that might be flagged at this stage. I won't tell you about the second one. And then there's a picture of Keir Starmer and Mrs. Starmer. Why that is relevant, we'll come to that in a moment as well. So just some illustrations of crises that you might come across every day. In every set of news headlines, there will be crises. Today is no different. So this session is a mini guide to crises. We'll look at some examples and the impact of them. I'll look at some definitions of crisis. What constitutes a crisis? Is everything bad that happens a crisis? Or is it just, a slight inconvenience and something that you can manage locally? So what constitutes a crisis? What defines it? We're going to look at the best practice skill set, and that's something that increasingly clients value. We know from research, certainly the PRCA, the CIPR do research amongst their client base to see what are the essential skills that they value in the people that they employ and promote. And the skill set and proven experience of successfully managing crisis is amongst the top of those skills that people really, really value. Keeping a cool head in a crisis can stand you in very good stead. Having a plan, what you can do and why it matters. And we'll learn about why reputation has a value. I mean, we could do a whole course on looking at corporate reputation, how that's built, how it's won and lost. But we're just going to touch upon that as part of the essentials that we go through today. Learning from crisis. It's no good surviving a crisis unless you learn from the experience and pick up some of the ideas of what could be done better, what went well, what went badly, what could be improved upon. So learning from a crisis is part of that essential set of skills and experience and processes that will help you protect your company and protect the reputation of your client for the future. Bad news and good news. I suppose I reference here advice to me when I first started working in PR. And I had a really fantastic mentor in Rod Cook, who was the head of PR at Derbyshire County Council. He's been in the CIPR Power Book many times. But he said to me, and I've always kept this as a kind of guiding principle, is that somewhere within your organisation, on every day of every week of the year, there will be somebody doing something they shouldn't or something going wrong that is going to cause you an issue. So be prepared. Basically saying, be prepared, have a plan. And that's really stood me in good stead. And I'm very grateful for the advice that was given to me. The other piece of advice I would give to all of you, and I'm sure you're very aware of this, but no harm in repeating it, is that always put people first. The impact of a crisis on actual real people must be the priority first and always. How it affects people. If you keep that centre stage in everything that you do, you won't go far wrong. So always remember that people first mantra. So let's look at some definitions of a crisis. A crisis disrupts or affects the entire organisation or has the potential to do so. And that's a quote from Timothy Coombs, who for some is deemed the godfather of crisis communications, one of the foremost academic writers around academic theory guiding best practice principles in crisis communications. Then we move on to perceptual. So perception threatens important expectations that stakeholders have of the organisation. Again, Timothy Coombs. So if something is perceived to be the case, if there is a perception that something is not right or that something has gone badly wrong, that is just as important and can be just as damaging as an actual threat or an actual event. Even if it's not the case, it needs to be tackled, it needs to be dealt with. A crisis interrupts normal business transactions and can sometimes threaten the existence of an organisation. That's Kathleen Fernbanks, so another of the kind of top-ranking writers around crisis communications. In terms of types of crisis, well, you name it, there are so many we could look at. Strikes affecting travel, strikes affecting core services, boycotts of products or services that can affect the running of an organisation, that can bring an organisation to a halt. A product failure, so a product may have been tampered with or a product may develop a fault that you weren't aware of. This happens. We know this in product safety recalls for things like child's prams, leading car manufacturers. This happens in any given year, and companies have to take robust and swift action to remedy this issue and recall products and make sure that essential information is provided to their customer base. You can have things like product tampering. One of the most famous issues in crisis management history was when there was the tampering of some painkiller products. The Johnson & Johnson company in America, a product called Tylenol, which was their foremost leading painkiller, bit like Nurofen in the UK. It was poisoned with cyanide deliberately by somebody setting out to cause harm. People died as a result of the product tampering, but it led to probably one of the best examples of crisis management in industrial history, in that they recalled the products, they redesigned the tamper-proof blister packs for painkillers, which we now see as being a routine part of our everyday life when we need to take painkillers. That resulted in big part due to a really unpleasant and dangerous situation that arose for Johnson & Johnson in the US, but they reacted really well. Their crisis management was par excellence, and it's gone down in history as one of the best examples, case studies often used in teaching about how to do it really, really well. You can have things like natural disasters. You can have misconduct, management misconduct. We're seeing that with Mohammed Al-Fayed, a historical case, as we'll come to that in a moment. Terrorism or accidents, just bad things that happen that you can't necessarily always predict. To a degree, you can predict a lot of the things that are going to affect your company or organisation by looking at some of the core functions of your organisation, but we'll come to that in a moment in terms of risk assessment. So the rise of crisis management, is it increasingly valued as a skill set by organisations, and it's improved over the past few decades as skill sets have become more refined, as we've become more aware of what are those essential qualities and skills and actions that need to be taken during a crisis. Need to touch upon reputation. So reputation is a vital commercial asset that organisations squander at their peril. And that's from Regesta and Larkin, who are two of the foremost experts in crisis communications, very much the go-to experts in, what's the best thing to do? What are the essential contacts to make? What are the essential communications you need to make sure are in place? Reputation is what you say about yourself and what others say about you. So, it can work in lots of different directions, but it's something that is increasingly prized and increasingly possible to place a tangible value on in terms of the value of a company. So a damaged reputation can lead to share price falls, can lead to problems with the company's sheer existence. So it needs to be protected at all costs. Stakeholder activism, we're in a world now where consumers have a dialogue with companies. It's not about one-way communication. It's increasingly about having a conversation with the people who buy our products or services or support what we do if we're a charity. And that's absolutely as it should be. So stakeholder activism, where people take action against companies that they're not happy with, consumers, shareholders, employee activists, they're increasingly vocal. And the means to do so is increasingly accessible with things like social media. So we need to be very nimble, very agile, and very across all our social media feeds as well. So what makes a crisis? Let's look at some examples briefly. So Mohammed Al Fayed. So in recent weeks, you will recall there've been headlines in our national media in the UK looking at the former boss, now deceased, of Harrods in the UK, a heritage brand, very much prized as a premium quality brand. But the headlines were about the sexual harassment, sexual assault allegations against Mohammed Al Fayed, women coming forward and saying they'd had horrendous experiences and making allegations to the police. And many more have come through since those first days of the allegations being made. To add insult to injury to those coming forward, it begins to transpire that there was an alleged collusion by some of those around Mohammed Al Fayed to enable this misconduct, to enable this law breaking, and very much damaging to the reputation of the company, to the legacy brand, and to the value of Harrods. More importantly, very, very damaging to the women who were in the teeth of that storm and subject to his misconduct. So a damaged, tarnished brand on the back of one person's misconduct. We had another example, the prisoner early release scheme, which was announced by the new Labour government shortly after its election. Problems arising from this became necessary, it was argued by the government, because of prison overcrowding. They made the decision to release thousands of prisoners early to alleviate some of the pressure on the prison service. But problems arose from the nature of those who were released into the community and created a perception of a government not really being in control of kind of law and order. Partly this was caused by the need to create more space in prisons because of the rioting that we experienced in the summer. So there were rioting, people were incarcerated on the back of their misconduct, but this created even more pressure on an already way overstretched prison service in the UK. But some people were released into the community, calling additional pressure upon accommodation needs, but also concerns about the safety of the public from people released early, for committing sometimes violent assaults and related serious crimes. So perception set up and reputational damage there for the newly incoming Labour government. Another issue for the new government was the story about the Prime Minister and some of the cabinet members accepting donations from a senior peer towards the cost of things like outfits, clothes, glasses, tickets to Taylor Swift concerts, which creates a perception of people taking money for things that aren't necessary. And because particularly rankles with the public, because we had Keir Starmer as a Prime Minister. This is not a party political thing. I would be talking about this if this was a Tory government or it was the Social and Liberal Democrats, but it's about that perception that is set up of people taking money where they shouldn't, so conduct that is inappropriate. And that runs contrary to their claims of being a government of public service. So again, damaging reputational perception set up around Labour donor cash. the post office and Fujitsu. We know the Horizon scandal has led to the jailing and the prosecution of many innocent sub-postmasters. That's been playing out over some months now, very damaging in terms of confidence in this organisation. Fake news sometimes throws its head up, stuff that's actually not true, but there's a perception that something is happening that needs to be addressed. So fake news can cause problems as well. And I'll touch briefly on Thor the Walrus, in one of the most unexpected crisis stories in recent years. I live and I work from my home in the east coast of the UK in Scarborough. And 2 years ago, almost 2 years to the date, we had a visit from an adolescent walrus who was called Thor, and he arrived just before Christmas and caused all sorts of furore. He landed in the harbour down in the centre of town, the sort of centre of the tourist area of Scarborough, and it led to a crisis that the local council and North Yorkshire Police and the local Sea Life Rescue Centre and all sorts of experts had to manage and make up a plan to manage, because it was something that had never happened before, very, very quickly. So over the course of a couple of days, the adolescent walrus Thor, who had pulled up just for a rest on the slipway of the harbour, created a furore of the need for a police cordon. We had journalists from all over the world descend upon Scarborough. We had visitors from all over the country descend upon Scarborough to have a look at this beautiful animal who'd never before visited Scarborough, but chose to stop on his way to Iceland, and had no idea of the excitement that was being caused. One of the definitions of a crisis is around something that halts the normal operation of business or an organisation. And Thor certainly managed to do that. The New Year's celebrations in Scarborough usually focus around a fireworks display, but that had to be cancelled because of Thor, because it was considered that this would be in breach of the Countryside and Wildlife Act. So to keep it nice and peaceful and not to startle Thor, they cancelled the New Year fireworks extravaganza. Everybody was quite happy with that, actually, because nobody wanted to upset the walrus. And we had Scarborough's mayor, Eric Broadbent, who was who's not used to being interviewed by any other than probably Scarborough News or local radio, was on television in Australia talking about Thor the walrus. But yeah, he certainly made an impact. So a very unusual crisis, but one that needed to be dealt with. I doubt very much, when we talk about having a plan, I doubt very much that Scarborough Council or North Yorkshire Police had a plan in place for a walrus crisis, but I think you can perhaps forgive them that. So, crisis management, the role of PR. Dealing with a crisis is a specific PR skill set. You're desperately trying to establish the facts whilst all sorts of things are happening around you. You're inundated with social media messages, phone calls and demands from the media, and you're trying to find the answers to key questions. In the eye of a storm, what you need is a crisis plan. What you can do, you can get organised. Know your client or organisation inside out. Know, metaphorically, where the bodies are buried. Think the unthinkable. Do an audit. When you're doing that proactive, before the crisis happens process of looking at what an organisation does, anticipate what are the most likely scenarios that are going to strike your organisation. And then you can do something like give them a likelihood score out of 5. That's the model used by Kathleen Fern-Banks. So what's most likely, what's least likely, what's very unlikely. You can give it a score out of 5 to assess a sort of at a glance assessment of what is likely to hit your organisation. Get organised, have a crisis management communications plan, have a crisis response team who know what their roles are in advance. Make sure you've got template holding statements, a press release and other materials in place and ready to be completed, updated and used in the event of something going badly wrong. Prepare for a crisis press conference, which is sometimes a device that can be really, really useful. I wouldn't say it's always something that you need to have, but it's something to keep up your sleeve just in case it's going to be useful in the particular instance you find yourselves. Monitor media coverage and activity, so you keep track of what's being said and where, and you can then correct things that aren't being represented correctly as you go along. Evaluate and learn the lessons from your experience. We see that, in every day of the week, don't we, in our wider society, in things like public inquiries into the events of our COVID-19 crisis, where we had hundreds of thousands of people die during the mass pandemic. We had the Manchester Arena bombing. which again was subject to a public inquiry to look at the lessons that could be learned, and the Grenfell Tower fire tragedy, which, as we know, the report into the Grenfell Tower tragedy has just been published with a series of recommendations about what needs to be done. Make sure if you have a plan that you've got online and hard copies for no better reason than you might be subject to an IT crisis in which case you're going to need hard copies of all those materials to work from. Continuing, get organised. Your crisis response team needs a team manager, and that can often be the public relations officer. You need to have a key spokesperson who is comfortable working in the media, possibly media trained. You know, sometimes you'll get a naturally capable spokesperson, but not everybody's comfortable when a microphone is put in front of them. So make sure they're comfortable with being the spokesperson. Make sure that they're 5 C's aware. Now, the 5 C's is a useful device I use in teaching, and that's about being competent, credible, confident around issues of crisis. So competent, credible, confident, very, very essential that you are aware of the need to keep those competencies very close to you. In terms of your crisis response team, also have people from operations, depending on the nature of the crisis, from your legal department, someone from human resources, from your finance section. So the members of your team will be specific to the crisis. So that's something that can be decided as the nature of the crisis unfolds. You need to have contact details and a prior awareness within the team of what their roles are. Have a priority ordered list of key publics, and they can be from customers, board members, suppliers, investors, employees, trade unions, government, and the media. And the media, we're talking about the paid, earned, shared, and owned media. So all of those elements of media should and can be used during a crisis. And also have a directory within your crisis plan, both online and hard copies, with named contacts and groups. I'm going to move swiftly on from paid, earned, and shared media. Other key tools, a holding statement can be issued within the first few moments. It's a very simple communication which can be issued pretty much as soon as you know a crisis is occurring. Then you have a media release within the first few hours. There needs to be a streamlined sign-off process, so the most essential people to have sight of that and to sign it off to make sure it's releasable. You might also consider having a contingency website, what you call a dark site. And I don't mean the dark web in terms of some of the murky illegal content that we come across and there's an awareness of in society. This is where you have a contingency website which is only activated during a crisis. You'll find parts of the world like New Zealand and Japan where they're subject to earthquakes and sort of natural disaster events on a regular basis. They're past masters at having really good emergency websites that are activated when they're really needed. Make sure your internal communications is streamlined and up to speed. You need to be communicating with staff just as importantly as you communicate with your external audiences. Have a Q&A pre-prepared as far as you possibly can and make sure that's updated quickly. And that's about making sure that you've got useful shortcut for some of the most obvious questions that can be an aid memoir for your crisis response team, but it's also a shortcut for media to some of the most obvious questions that will be asked. You might also consider having the template for a leaflet in the hours and days during the crisis. Depends on the nature of the crisis. Other media content that is sometimes quite useful to avoid a vacuum of media information when the crisis is playing out are things like the generic corporate information, things like B-roll films about the production process. That can be really useful and is obviously something that you can prepare in advance, can make available in advance. A holding statement is for use before detailed information is available. So the date and time of issued, the number of the issue is important. In fact, I'll flip through to that. The number of the issue, it just tells people at a glance, the media at a glance, at what stage in the crisis this was issued, so they can see the sequence of information. So that gives you the idea of something that's very, very brief. So we're getting reports. It's just an example of a major incident in the centre of wherever which occurred, reports indicate, and then obviously you can flesh that out according to the details as they become more available. You won't be able to say very much, but what it does is establish your organisation as the central point of coordinated information for this particular crisis. So you establish an authoritative centre of contact for the media. Very, very important at an earlier stage. This presentation is going to be available afterwards. I'm going to skim through the next few slides quite quickly, but you can always come back to this. So press release, tried and tested device, who, why, what, when, where, and how, about 250 words, include a quote or quotes. Think about the pyramid structure, which is about having the most important information at the first contact, and then you can work through your first crucial introductory paragraph of about 25 words, contact details for follow-up, editor's notes, which can just give you your boilerplate. So that's the generic company information. Think about providing pictures and image and film information as well. And you might want to include company and partner web links and links to social feeds as well. And I'll flip through that. I think that's been covered. Your website, a dark site, I think we've covered this. Consider this as an essential tool, and it can be used to host things like downloadable PDFs of leaflets, which can provide really good, useful information. It can signpost to helplines. It can offer practical advice for those affected. So I mentioned New Zealand. They very often activate their websites within moments of earthquakes. They have hundreds of earthquakes every year, so they're very used to dealing with crises. And they've got loads of useful information about how to, where to find clean water, sanitation advice, help for vulnerable people in the community. A lot of this is hosted on their dark sites, which are activated just for the crisis. Keep staff informed. Absolutely. Don't keep staff in the dark. They can be your best advocates and best ambassadors in the event of a crisis. So make sure that they know exactly what's going on. Remind them of the policy on media. And this might be perceived as an attempt to gag staff, but it's really more about making sure that there's a central authoritative contact for media information. Otherwise, you've got all sorts of different people giving different lines of information, and that can actually cause problems rather than help the situation. So, remind staff of saying something like, should you be approached by the media, please advise staff to contact the press office, so that the whole thing is coordinated and nicely sort of circled round. It's no longer possible to ensure that staff don't learn new information via media. Of course they will, and they need to be able to communicate sound and confirmed information rather than rumour and scaremongering, which, can be the case. It can very often be that, media, if they don't get what they need at first contact, because their job is to get to the root of the story very quickly, they might approach someone who's got a less authoritative view on what's happening. And that's not helpful. It muddies the water. It creates more problems than it alleviates. Make sure that you continue to communicate during the course of the crisis. So as a clearer picture emerges, key facts can be confirmed. New information will be coming through all the time. Not all of it you're going to be able to confirm, and don't be tempted to people please. We're all guilty of wanting to keep people happy by telling them things that they want to know, but you won't have all the answers in the early stages of a crisis, and that's all right. Most journalists will understand that in a crisis in particular, you will find it very difficult to confirm information. So don't be tempted to confirm stuff that you're not absolutely sure about. Consider about announcing media conferences and interview opportunities. Obviously, don't let that get in the way of the actual crisis response, but a media conference can be useful in that it can give media access to the essential personnel managing a crisis in a way that's very organised and in one place. But it's a judgment call that you're going to have to make very carefully, because it can also be something of a feeding frenzy if it goes wrong. So you need to make sure that the people that you put forward to sit on your media conference are comfortable, know exactly what their role is, are comfortable with the information that they're able to give, and know not to go beyond the brief, know not to do the thing like people pleasing and trying to give information that's not confirmed, and being able to say no. Sometimes you'll get situations where you're asked a question and you just don't know the answer to it, and you just have to say so, and I'll get back to you. I don't know the answer to that. I'll make a note of your query and I will come back to you. That's absolutely fine. Keep the media feed going. So keep talking. Don't allow that vacuum to develop. And that doesn't mean that you're making up information. You can keep re-emphasizing the information that you do know, what facts are confirmed, and to answer specific questions to the best of your ability. So there's always something that you can say. I adhere to the school of never say no comment. There's always something that you can offer up. And your role really is to keep the outside world, particularly through the funnel of media, but also through social media feeds, populated with the narrative that's been confirmed about what's happening. It's reassuring. It makes the company look like it knows what it's doing. A Q&A can be an aid for the crisis team and for spokespeople. It can set out key messages. I would say an ideal of 6 to 8 questions on a Q&A, and it allows you to anticipate and answer media questions. It's an information shortcut for those asking the questions, but it also helps your top team when they're answering questions from the media, takes the pressure off them a little bit. And it's usually about the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Leaflet we've talked about. I'm thinking of an example of when I was working in PR for a local authority. We had a leaflet drop. We had several villages underwater where they were only accessible by boat. This is in South Yorkshire going back to 2010. There was a moment where it was useful to get information into those flood affected areas with a leaflet drop. So, and that was giving essential information about, where help was available, emergency accommodation, clean water, sanitation, and ongoing support from the public service agencies. So it's about public information, but that can be really useful. Think about things like plain English, and also about where you're working with communities where there are multiple languages to deal with, about access to translations, and making sure in advance when you're planning around crisis communications, you take that into account, because that needs to be thought about in advance, to organise in advance. Make sure a leaflet is appropriate to the situation, so it's kept simple, practical and direct, and ideally downloadable to print. So a simple PC user-friendly version of it that's downloadable and easy to print. So for all channels and to all publics. Press conferences can be useful, a useful device to get people in the same place. But as I say, there can be a media feeding frenzy, because you're giving direct access to your key spokespeople at a time when they're already under pressure. So be very clear on the purpose and role of the spokesperson. Control the start and finish. Make sure that media knows right at the start when they're, this is what's going to be happening. This is who's going to be talking. This is what time we're starting. This is what they will be covering. And this is how long the press conference will last. And then we will take questions. So you will usually give an update statement. There will usually be an opportunity to ask specific questions of specific areas of the organisation. I don't know, it might be legal, it might be operational, it might be your human resources, it might be police or fire or ambulance. So whatever is specific to the crisis you're managing. So an update statement, plus then at the end of the conference, you will allow some time for questions, but it needs to be not to be open-ended. There needs to be that sense of control with a press conference. Don't just let it go on and on, not least for the reassurance of your press conference team, but also media need to know. They want to know how long they're going to be, because time is very valuable. Journalists never have lots of time. They're always on duty, but they also need to know when they can get away. Always remember with your spokespeople that the mic is never off, and that history is littered with disasters, media disasters, where spokespeople have carried on talking when they think the microphone is switched off. So one of the most famous ones in recent decades is Gordon Brown, who was in the run-up to the general election, Bigot where he was talking to a Sky journalist, thought his microphone was switched off when he got back into his ministerial car, and was describing and being quite insulting to a member of the public that he'd just spoken to, and talked about her. She's just a bigot. And that's gone down in history as one of the most famous gaffes by a politician. Certainly didn't do him any favours in terms of the election result. What's your message? Be clear, concise and succinct. Have no more than 3 or 4 key messages you want to get across. Understand how journalists work and think. Listen out for questions asking you to agree with a particular point of view. think carefully about the responses. So, you know, there are phishing questions that journalists are quite canny about using. People tell me, or is there not a danger, and that you're walking into a trap, basically a negative trap, and you know, it's worth, in the process of preparing your top team for a press conference or for an interview, watch for those questions coming through, and you know, don't be drawn into agreeing with something if you don't actually agree, and don't be drawn into giving information on something you haven't got the answers to. It's okay to say, I don't have the answer, I'll get back to you, I'll come back to you. That's perfectly fine. Yeah. At the end of the process, you review and learn what went well and what could be improved. Your crisis team, how well did they do? Are they the right people? Do you need to include other people? Do you need media training for some of those included? Media coverage review. Look at the key messages that were reflected in the coverage of the crisis. Was the helpline used? Was the coverage factually correct? Are there social issues arising, and how were they resolved? Think about doing some crisis scenario planning. I mean, I worked in the public sector for some years, and we used to have, certainly in local government, really, really excellent at emergency planning and crisis scenario planning. So having tabletop exercises with all the different emergency services. And I once took a group of journalism and PR students to an emergency scenario at Robin Hood, Doncaster Sheffield Airport, where there was a simulated scenario of aviation fuel leaking onto the tarmac of one of the runways, and refugees arriving from a war-torn part of the world. So you've got a number of different issues playing out at the same time. You've got special branch officers thrown into the equation, and I'd got journalism students trying to get information about what was happening, and PR students practicing their skills in trying to field and manage the communications response. So do consider that as part of your ongoing kind of investment in planning around crises. Think about stakeholders, your stakeholders, you know, get some feedback from them. How well did they feel communicated with during the crisis? What could be done better? And look at whether other resources or training is needed as part of that. Learn from and prepare to be better in the future. These are some press conference examples we won't have time to look at today, but do take the time if you're interested in learning more about good examples of press conferences. The one from Todd Schmaderer, the Omaha police chief, it was around an incident involving the shooting of a police officer. Obviously an awful incident, but he did incredibly well. Considered to be a textbook example of somebody communicating as a human being in a crisis, doing really well. So there's a number of different examples there for you to look at. Just a review of the essential steps, and then we're going to we'll set some time aside for taking some questions from you. So recognize that a crisis is going to happen. Every day of the week, something awful is going to happen somewhere in the world, and it might be your company or organization that's in the teeth of the storm. So recognize that that's going to be the case, and do yourselves a favor, plan, train, and prepare for the most obvious crises arising. You can't prepare for everything, but you can do preparation. You can anticipate that something is going to happen, and look at the core functions of your organisation to identify where those crises are likely to arise. There's always going to be something that takes you by surprise, but you can reduce the impact by being prepared and by anticipating. Manage the crisis well. Make sure you've got a good team that knows each of them, that know their role in the crisis. Learn, review, and evaluate how well the crisis is handled, what could be done better. Look at and examine the wider effects and take action to ameliorate and to shore up and to repair the damage done by the crisis. Increasingly, it's about listen first. You know, with social media, you're likely to be probably last in the queue to know. It's likely to break on social media, so you won't have the luxury of a long time to get your head around a crisis developing. It's likely that, you know, you're going to be hearing secondhand, possibly through social media, because it happens so quickly. That's okay. We just need to, you know, step up to make sure that, you know, we react really, really quickly. You can't answer every issue on social media. But you can be very prepared. One thing I was going to cover in one of the slides we've skipped past actually is the use of AI in social media feeds for content. It's a really good idea to, as a policy, pause your AI content, pause your scheduled content in a crisis, because it's likely that you're going to have to be very, very crisis specific and extra sensitive to the specifics of the crisis. And scheduled content, as we know, can bite back and trip us up in a big way if used in a crisis and is found to be contradictory or insensitive. Lots of media coverage about examples of where this has happened in the past. So make sure you look at your use of scheduled content and AI, particularly on social in a crisis. Increasingly, it's about listen first, but that's not a bad policy to be in anyway when you're in PR. Listen to what your customers are saying. Do that horizon scanning every day to make sure you know what the issues are that are going to be affecting your organisation. Okay. If you're interested in learning more about effective crisis management, the CIPR through the Oxford College of Marketing offers a specialist diploma, and you can get some more information via that web link. That's one I teach on, and yeah, it's a useful way of looking in more detail at how to prepare yourself for a crisis. So thank you very much for your for attending. Are there any questions from anyone? I'll stop sharing now. Actually, there's one more slide, which is the references used in the presentation. But I'll stop sharing now. You can go back and have a look at that. So what have we got in the chat? So we've got fake news spreads like wildfire and at times hurts the organisations and reputations in no time. What's the go-to approach? What's the go-to approach? Bear with me, I'm just scrolling down. You advise to respond swiftly and regain trust and reputation quickly. I mean, fake news will jump up and bite you. Stuff is out there in the media environment every day, and historically that perhaps isn't true. But if a perception is set up that is the case, you need to respond to it. So you need to prioritize your resources. You can't absolutely respond to everything. Resources are finite. So it's a question of anticipate, plan, prepare and prioritize those media feeds that you're going to respond to and prioritize those issues that you're going to respond to, and have your holding statement. Use your holding statement via your social feeds as well, because that at the very least that says we're on it, we're on the case, we are responding. We don't have all the answers at the moment, but we will keep you informed and we will be updating you regularly. And as soon as information becomes available, we will be communicating that to the widest audience. So it's about keeping communicating, anticipating, making sure people know sometimes the limitations of what you're able to do in a crisis. You can't answer everything all the time. No organization has infinite resources, and it's okay to say so. So I think it's be organised, get your holding statement and your emergency communications tools set up, ready to update, have your templates ready, and that is going to stand you in really good stead when the calls come and you need to be communicating really quickly. Make sure your team is prepared. So it is about anticipation, planning and being prepared. It can really buy you time. Any other questions?
We have a question from Laura. She asked, what are the 5 C's?
Oh, clarity, control, concern, confidence, competence. So clarity, make sure that your spokespeople speak clearly and not in gobbledygook. Control, make sure that they appear to be in control of the situation. It might be that you're not always in control of the situation, but to be as in charge as possible, to give that reassuring sense of something terrible is happening, but we're on the case and this is what we're doing. So clarity, speak clearly, avoid organisational jargon and gobbledygook. Control concern, express concern for the impact on those affected by the crisis. Clarity, control, concern, confidence, competence. Confidence, use a spokesperson who speaks fluently, who doesn't appear to fluff or to give the impression of someone who's uncomfortable. History is littered with examples of people who are put forward as spokespeople but who aren't very good at it. One I'm thinking of is Tony Haywood, who was the unfortunate spokespeople in the teeth of the storm around BP's, the oil company's Deepwater Horizon disaster going back to 2010, 2012. And he was awful. He spent more time moaning about the impact of the crisis on himself than he did on recognising the hardship and the impact on those affected by the oil spill. He said, I just want my life back. And it's, again, famous quote, but it really wasn't appropriate to the role or to the moment. So have someone who speaks with confidence, is clear, doesn't use jargon, shows concern for those affected, speaks with confidence about the topic, so is well informed, or as possible, as much as it is possible to be in an unfolding situation, and who is competent. So those are the 5 C's: clarity, control, concern, confidence, competence. Are there any another question here? Are there any recommended sources for trialing the dark sites and learning more about them or how they work? It's something we teach about on the Oxcom course, so we do give examples. I'd say have a look at, if you just want to have a look at things like Christchurch in New Zealand, which is constantly subject to earthquakes, so they're always having to activate their dark sites. Do some reading around it. I'd say the Exploring PR and Marketing Communications text by Waddington and Tench is a good textbook to use to look at dark site and how they're used. But you could probably get information just online about how dark sites are used. But I tried Christchurch, New Zealand is a really good example that I've used before in teaching, because they have so much practice at managing crises. They know how to do it really, really well. And, you know, experience is everything. Clyde Collins, given the current landscape of media crisis from misinformation to corporate scandals, how can organisations effectively differentiate between a legitimate crisis and a minor issue, ensuring they allocate their resources wisely without escalating unnecessary panic? The measure, it's a good question. The measure is, you know, to what extent does it stop your business from operating as usual? So the definition of a crisis, does it at the tipping point, is that moment beyond which it's not possible for an organisation to continue operating normally. That's a crisis. An issue is something that has to be actively considered and actively dealt with, and perhaps actively managed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that issues always develop into a crisis. If they're sufficiently successfully handled, you might neutralise an issue such that it doesn't interrupt the normal business operations. But I'd say the measure in terms of when you actually have to intervene and activate your crisis response team and get your team on the case and think about all the things we've talked about during this session, is when it starts to affect the company's capacity to operate normally. So, and that will be apparent. That will be apparent from the impact on your organisation. So I think that's the easiest way to differentiate between something that's an issue which needs looking at, needs attention, and a crisis which will stop you in your tracks. Yeah, so that's the measure that ensures that you allocate your resources wisely. And it's also about that, coming back to that process of prioritizing, anticipating and prioritizing what are the most likely crises that are going to affect your organization. If you anticipate what are the core functions of my organization. So if it's a car company, just for example, it's likely to be something to do with the mechanical function or the design or a product issue with one of the models of your cars. Toyota's had them in the past, Renault's had them. You know, it's quite commonplace for car companies to have to do a product safety recall, and these are entirely anticipatable. So you should have a plan in place to make sure that that's done very, very swiftly and effectively when the call comes, when it becomes apparent that there is a problem. If you're a pharmaceutical company, it is likely that a crisis is going to be to do with either the supply of those drugs or a faulty batch of those drugs. So, you know, it might be a vaccine related issue. So these are issues for companies that are very specific to their core function. So it should be possible to anticipate a range of issues that have a likelihood of happening. And I think if you take the time out to give some time and resources to actually anticipating and planning, that's going to stand your company in good stead. You're never going to be able to plan for everything, but you can plan for those things that are most likely. And if it's something that's completely left field that you haven't put a plan in place for, or the basics of a plan in place for, media will tend to understand. It's one of the few occasions where, so if it's a natural disaster, for instance, or if it's a flooding or extreme weather, or there's an aeroplane crash, I was involved in the response to an aeroplane crash over the M1 in Kegworth, decades ago. But it was one of those, nobody could have predicted that a passenger liner would crash into a motorway bridge, but it did in the evening. And the chair of British Midland Airways at the time went straight out to the scene in a radio car and was talking to media from his car phone for the 9 o'clock bulletins, just saying, we don't have a lot of detail. We know this is happening. We've got support being given to the families of those affected, and was just able to talk to the issue. But it wasn't something that could have been particularly anticipated. But yeah, there's a lot you can do by planning and anticipating and managing in advance that will help your company recover better than if you just allow the whole thing to take you by surprise by not putting that time in during peacetime when there's no crisis unfolding. That's probably a very long answer to a short question, but hopefully we've covered quite a lot of what you were after there, Clyde. Any other questions? Okay, if I'd leave you with anything, it's that, assume that at some point, whatever the organisation you work for, a crisis is going to happen, a crisis is going to strike. It will come through. Actually, I think we've maybe got a few more messages coming here. Where we go. Yeah. No, don't think there are any. What strategies can you recommend for PR agencies to proactively protect their reputation through transparent communications with clients during a crisis? Yeah, I think we've answered that one. It's about being prepared. It's about making sure that it's a priority to actually protect your clients by taking that luxury of time to anticipate and prepare and plan. And I think there isn't any way around that. You do have to give some time and resources in order to be in the best possible position to respond quickly and demonstrate that those 5 C's, the clarity, control, concern, confidence, competence, when the call comes, when the social media post comes that something awful is happening, your heart will be racing, but you'll think, actually, we've got a plan in place to deal with that. So we're going to be all right. And to make sure you keep talking, put people first. Don't make stuff up. Don't feel tempted to people please. And yet plan, and make sure you acknowledge the human impact of any crisis as an absolute priority. So if it involves things like casualties or fatalities sometimes, as is sadly sometimes the case, and I've been involved in crisis management where we had multiple fatalities involving a bus crash, service users with learning difficulties some years ago. Horribly awful time. But we made sure that we had a good crisis response team in place who knew the drill. They knew how to talk, and they knew how to. They were posted at the hospital to field questions from media about casualties coming through. They were posted at the day centre where the service users were used to being provided with support, and also at headquarters where further media inquiries were coming through, and made sure that at all times that sense of compassion and that concern for the human impact is absolute foremost in your mind, beyond any damage to property. People first, absolutely people first. And that will reflect, not only is it the right thing to do, but it also makes sure that you prioritize the things that are most important, and people come first. 2 more messages. Let me just see if there's anything we haven't done. Oh, Kate Betts, lovely. Fabulous. That would be lovely, Kate. I would love to catch up. So yeah, I used to work with Kate at Derbyshire County Council many years ago. So we've got stories to share. Lovely. I think that's as much as I've got to, unless there's any further questions, Cumberai. I think that's us done for the
Yeah,
moment.
I think those were all the questions.
Yeah. Thank
So
you so much,
just
everybody, for joining. I
thank you
think
so much.
we've answered the one from Clyde about agencies. Yeah, if there's any follow-up, because people can get access to the presentation, can they?
Absolutely. So we'll send out the recording of this webinar to you all in the next few days. You can also find the inquiries email in the chat, I've sent this before. And lots of you have expressed interest in studying a CIPR course with us, and some of you will already be enrolled with us. If you do want to find out more about the CIPR courses we offer, please just get in touch and we'll be happy to help. You can also find the link to our website in the chat. This is just to all the CIPR courses that we offer. And then you can also find the CIPR Specialist Diploma in Crisis Communications. But if there are no more questions, then I think that's everything for today. So thank you so much for joining. We hope you enjoyed it and found it really interesting. I found it very, very interesting. And hopefully we'll hear from some of you soon.
Oh, that's nice. Anna Valdeperas. Lovely. Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, it's amazing what you can do when you have to. But it's good fun. It's good fun. Crisis management can be good fun too as well. So do try and enjoy the experience if that doesn't sound kind of a bit counterintuitive. Wonderful. Okay, Kumbarai.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really helpful and
Good.
very insightful.
Oh, good. Okay, lovely. Well, take care, everyone. Go careful out there, and yeah, I hope no
Perfect.
crises strike today, at least.
Perfect. Thank you.